What do the following living things have in common? These plant-like organisms found off the California coast, this microscopic amoeba, and this slimy mold on a decaying log. All these living things belong to the kingdom Protista in the domain Eukarya. What exactly are protists? What are some of their common characteristics? How are they different from other types of living things? What are some of the different kinds of protists, and where are they found? During the next few minutes, we're going to answer these questions and others as we investigate protists. For over 2 billion years, the largest organisms on Earth were single-celled bacteria smaller than 6 microns in size. But about 2.5 billion years ago, an incredibly important event in the history of life took place: the development of larger, more complex cells. The change from relatively simple cells to more complex cells is one of the most important steps in the evolution of life. These new, more complex cells are called eukaryotes. Over time, eukaryotic cells gave rise to plants, animals, and fungi. Eukaryotes that are clearly not plants, not animals, nor fungi have been lumped together in the kingdom Protista, commonly called protists. The kingdom Protista is amazingly diverse and large. Protists can be single-celled, colonial, or multicellular. Some can even reach great sizes. The unifying feature of all protists is based on something they are not. They are not plants, animals, or fungi. In some respects, protists are a catch-all group, and their classification has not yet been entirely agreed upon. We'll use the traditional classification approach that includes protozoans, algae, slime molds, water molds, and mildews. The only clear common characteristic they share is that they are eukaryotic cells with membrane-bound nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. One way biologists group protists is based on the way they get food. Heterotrophic protists that eat other things for their nutritional needs are broadly grouped as animal-like protists. Animal-like protists, referred to as protozoans, are unicellular or colonial, in which a small group of singular cells live together. You observe. Describe the shape of this protozoan. As you can see, it has no definite shape and is continuously changing. This protozoan is an amoeba, and it's in the phylum Sarcodina. Sarcodines are single-celled protozoans commonly found in freshwater and saltwater. Sarcodines, such as amoebas, have no definite shape and move by means of false feet called pseudopods that are filled with cytoplasm. They also use pseudopods to surround and engulf food particles. Sarcodines most commonly reproduce via cell division. Some kinds of amoebas can cause diseases. Amoebic dysentery is an example and is most commonly contracted from drinking contaminated water. Some sarcodines, such as radiolarians and foraminiferans, are surrounded by protective shells. Radiolarians, for example, have glassy, silica-based skeletons. These organisms are abundant in the oceans. Looking at other types of protists, this interesting-looking protozoan called a paramecium is in the phylum Ciliophora. Ciliates, as they're commonly called, are surrounded by many hair-like projections called cilia. Cilia help these organisms move through the water and also guide food into the cell. Ciliates are different from other protozoans in that they have two different nuclei within the cell. Ciliates can reproduce asexually via binary fission as well as sexually in a process referred to as conjugation. Zooflagellates in the phylum Zoomastogina move in another way by beating a whip-like flagella. Many species of zooflagellates live in the bodies of plants or animals, with some being quite harmful. One harmful species is Trypanosoma brucei, which causes the disease African sleeping sickness spread by the bite of the tsetse fly. The last group of protozoans we'll discuss are sporozoans. These are organisms that are non-modal. In other words, they can't move themselves. They're also parasitic, meaning they live off another organism. They often cause disease in animals, including humans. One of the most well-known sporozoans is in the genus Plasmodium. It's a parasite that causes human malaria. Malaria is a disease that's killed millions of people over the centuries. The parasite is transmitted to humans by the bite of the female Anopheles mosquito. Believe it or not, this large plant-like organism is a protist. Plant-like protists, referred to as algae, are photosynthetic. Algae possess chloroplasts, as well as one or more different kinds of chlorophyll pigments. While algae have many plant-like characteristics, they're different from plants in that most do not contain many specialized tissues and organs that plants do. There are several phyla of algae that are separated principally on their various structural differences. One of the most interesting groups of algae are the euglenoids in the phylum Euglenophyta. These single-celled organisms that move via flagella are fascinating in that many species are both plant-like and animal-like. For example, the protists seen here under the microscope are in the genus Euglena. They contain many small chloroplasts used to carry out photosynthesis. But in the absence of light, these organisms can be heterotrophic, absorbing nutrients from the environment. One of the largest groups of algae, commonly referred to as golden algae, include over 10,000 species. Mostly unicellular, golden algae in the phylum Chrysophyta get their yellow-brown coloring from specific pigments. Diatoms, found in freshwater and saltwater, are the most numerous golden algae. You observe. Describe the general appearance of these microscopic diatoms. These diatoms tend to have regular geometric shapes with tiny holes that allow for the flow of materials in and out of the organism. The shells of diatoms consist of glass-like walls made of silica. They're extremely abundant in the oceans, serving as a source of food for fish and other sea life. Perhaps you've heard of people getting ill from eating shellfish like clams or mussels. These have been affected by specific toxin-carrying protists called dinoflagellates. In this phenomenon, called red tide poisoning, reddish blooms of dinoflagellates in coastal waters can affect large expanses of shellfish, making them unfit for human consumption. Dinoflagellates are single-celled marine protists that take the form of photosynthetic or heterotrophic organisms. Dinoflagellates serve as an important food source to many ocean animals. While swimming in a lake, you may have felt a slimy plant-like organism. Chances are this was a member of another phylum of protists, green algae. They're grouped in the phylum Chlorophyta. Green algae are not only found in salt and fresh water, but also in moist places on land, such as at the base of trees. Green algae contain the pigment chlorophyll B, and often other types of pigments as well. The composition of the cell wall and chloroplast structure closely resembles those of green plants. Some multicellular species exhibit a complex life cycle with alternating haploid and diploid phases. This large organism, called giant kelp, almost looks like it's an underwater tree. It's one of the largest protists on the planet, growing up to 100 meters in length. Giant kelp is a type of algae called brown algae in the phylum Phaeophyta. Brown algae, which includes many common seaweeds, are often found in cool ocean waters. Some brown algae that live along the shoreline have root-like structures that anchor to rocks. Others have gas-filled chambers that enable them to float. Many species have life cycles that exhibit alternation of generations. You observe. Describe the general color of this algae. It has a reddish color. This is red algae in the phylum Rhodophyta. Multicellular red algae, which is often attached to rocks in shallow waters, exhibit complex life cycles. Some organisms that are neither animal-like nor plant-like can be lumped into a group broadly referred to as fungus-like protists. They're somewhat similar to fungi in that they're heterotrophic, living on decomposing organic matter, while also exhibiting characteristics found in protozoans. Acellular slime molds in the phylum Myxomycota are one of the major fungus-like groups. In part of their life cycle, these organisms have an amoeba-like appearance called a plasmodium that forms a slow-moving, feeding, slimy mass. When environmental conditions become unfavorable, the slimy mass forms spore-producing structures. Spores are then released when favorable conditions return. Cellular slime molds in the phylum Acrasiomycota live in fresh water, moist soils, or on decaying plant matter. In what's called the feeding stage of their life cycle, they move around as individual amoeboid cells. When food becomes scarce, the cells congregate, forming a mass called a pseudoplasmodium. This structure is capable of producing haploid spores. The haploid spores, under favorable conditions, generate amoeboid cells, starting the feeding stage all over again. A third group of fungus-like protists are in the phylum Oomycota. They include water molds and downy mildews. These protists consist of finely branched single-celled filaments. They differ from true fungi in their cellular composition, life cycle, and in their sexual mode of reproduction. Water molds tend to live on dead things in fresh water, forming a cotton-like mass around the dead organism. Downy mildews are plant parasites. A species of downy mildew is what causes potato blight. This organism infected potato crops in Ireland from 1845 to 1847, precipitating the Irish potato famine. During the past few minutes, we explored some of the fascinating features of protists. We began by discussing the wide variety of organisms in this kingdom. Next, we began exploring the characteristics of specific groupings of protists, including animal-like protists such as sarcodines, ciliates, zooflagellates, and sporozoans. Some of the defining features of plant-like protists were then highlighted. We specifically discussed the wide variety of algae. Last, we took a brief look at the unusual characteristics of fungus-like protists. This rounded out our investigation of the wide and varied features of the fascinating protists. Fill in the correct word to complete the sentence. Number 1. Protists are in the domain . Number 2. Animal-like protists are referred to as . Number 3. This amoeba has no definite . Number 4. Protozoans such as paramecium are covered with hair-like structures called . Number 5. Zooflagellates move by beating whip-like . Number 6. Plant-like protists, referred to as, are photosynthetic. Number 7. Algae are different from plants in that they do not have many structures and organs. Number 8. The shell of this is made of silica. Number 9. Red tide poisoning is caused by specific types of . And number 10. Slime molds have a stage in which amoeboid cells move about.